Also that there has been a significant build-up of troops on the Jordanian border, right along the West Bank, and also a significant build-up of troops on the Golan Heights, the Syrian build-up of troops. And the Syrians, remember, also have warned that if Israel gets involved in a war in any situation, even if it's responding to an Iraqi attack, Syria will not tolerate Israel's involvement. And I suppose implicit in that threat is that Syria would split the Arab alliance and some sort of and would declare war on Israel. But of course we know no more about that at the moment.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. We'll come back to you the minute you do have some more news. Michael McMillan in Jerusalem. The White House has confirmed, to recap on the news so far, that the first action of the Gulf War has taken place. American F-15 fighter bombers have taken off from central and eastern Saudi Arabia, bound for Baghdad. In the Iraqi capital itself, there are reports of bombs being dropped and...
Now on BBC Two we go over to the newsroom and Michael Burke for a news report.
Iraq has accepted the Soviet peace plan to end the Gulf War. A few minutes ago, a Soviet spokesman gave details of talks tonight between the Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz and President Gorbachev. He said Iraq's response to the peace plan was positive and gave details of what had been decided. He said Iraq had agreed to what he described as a full and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. It would begin the second day after a ceasefire has been introduced and take place within a fixed timetable overseen by neutral forces chosen by the United Nations. As soon as 2/3 of the Iraqi forces had withdrawn, the UN would drop economic sanctions. Other UN resolutions would be dropped when the Iraqi withdrawal was complete. After the ceasefire, all prisoners of war would be released immediately. There'll be more details from Moscow tomorrow. Cheering broke out in the briefing room of the Soviet government after the announcement. There's been no reaction yet from America and Britain. President Gorbachev is reported to have phoned President Bush as soon as the talks were over. A fuller report at 1 on BBC One.
This is BBC Two. Now here's Suzanne Charlton looking through the weather window at the latest report for skiers.
Now on BBC One for the latest news, we join Martin Lewis.
President Bush is to go on television in just over half an hour's time to tell the American people that the end of the war is at hand. He's expected to say that the military war aims have been achieved, the liberation of Kuwait and the defeat of the Republican Guard, whose sole surviving units in the war area are tonight on the run, making a desperate attempt to escape. Pentagon sources predict that President Bush could fix a time for the end to the military campaign, but will not announce a ceasefire. That still depends on Iraq bowing completely and unconditionally to all 12 United Nations resolutions, a demand reinforced by the Security Council tonight. We'll be talking live to our Washington correspondent in just a moment. Full details in breakfast news and, of course, all the reaction at 6:30 on BBC One from the BBC Newsroom. Good night.
20 minutes on BBC Two, the Money Programme examines the effects on Western business of new American government initiatives to prevent the spread of technology that can be used to develop nuclear and chemical warfare. Here on BBC One in 25 minutes we're going to Andover for Songs of Praise. Now, in place of OK to Talk Feelings, which we're sorry we're not showing today, an extended news beginning earlier than scheduled with the time at 6:15.
Allied casualties in the first few hours of the ground offensive to free Kuwait are said to be remarkably light. The Allied commander breaks a news blackout to say he's delighted with progress. All first-day objectives have been achieved. In the face of the onslaught, 5,500 Iraqis have surrendered or been captured. Good evening. The Allied ground assault on occupied Kuwait began about 2 hours before dawn on the Gulf. It combined the forces of America, Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Syria, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain and Oman. It was a massive and, its commanders say, successful operation. The American general who leads the Allied forces, Norman Schwarzkopf, said the troops had run into only light opposition and that they'd taken 5,500 Iraqi prisoners. Allied casualties so far were, he said, remarkably light. 8 hours after President Bush's deadline for an Iraqi withdrawal, the Allies attacked from several directions. An artillery barrage across the Saudi-Kuwaiti border was accompanied by seaborne landings from the Gulf. Kuwaiti reports say Allied forces seized the strategic island of Failaka. On land, from the Saudi Arabian desert, military sources say the Allies broke into Kuwait at several points, though to preserve operational security, General Schwarzkopf gave no details of their objectives. The French commander said his force, with US units, struck deep into Iraq and 4 hours ago was 30 miles behind enemy lines, attacking Iraqi positions. There have been no reports of the Iraqis using chemical weapons. Here, the Prime Minister, John Major, said the ground war would not be long and that the Allies would win it. General Schwarzkopf went further and described the first day of the ground campaign as a dramatic success. Ben Brown was at his briefing in Riyadh. Just in, you are watching Patriot missiles being fired in Riyadh to intercept the incoming Scuds. Quite clearly a successful hit there. There was an alert in Dhahran, we understand, as well. And that is all for the moment. Our next scheduled news is an extended bulletin at 9:10, and there's a Newsnight special on BBC Two starting at 22:11. Goodbye for now.
Now it's time for the 9 o'clock news with Michael Burke.
Iraq says it's now returned all the Allied prisoners. Celebrating freedom, 35 more POWs come home, 9 of them are British. Fleeing for their lives, the refugees who say Saddam is crushing the rebellions against him. And there to say thanks, John Major tells the troops they're all heroes. Good evening. Iraq says it no longer holds any Allied prisoners of war. 35 more were released today and flown to Riyadh. 9 are British. 6 RAF men shot down in tornado bombers. Flight Lieutenant Adrian Nichol, Flight Lieutenant Rupert Clark, Flight Lieutenant Robert Stewart, Flight Lieutenant David Waddington and Flying Officer Simon Burgess. The 6th was named as Squadron Leader Bob Ankerson. The Defence Ministry refused to identify the 3 British soldiers released today. They're reported to be members of the SAS. 8 Britons are still listed as missing. 5 aircrew and 3 soldiers, again thought to be from the SAS.
This is BBC One.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Anna Ford and Andrew Harvey.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. The Gulf War is over after 42 days of fighting. Allied forces take up defensive positions to safeguard the peace. Saudi sources say there may be 100,000 Iraqi dead or injured. The Allies say they've taken 175,000 prisoners. The Prime Minister tells Saddam, "You must get rid of all your weapons of mass destructions." Celebrations on the streets of Baghdad as the Iraqis say it's a victory for them. And relief among soldiers' wives, but sadness for those who died. After 42 days of the war and just 100 hours of the land war, the peace in the Gulf tonight is holding. Iraq agreed a ceasefire shortly before 8 o'clock London time this morning, 3 hours after President Bush ordered the Allied offensive to stop. Earlier, Iraq had finally agreed to obey all the relevant UN resolutions. But the president insisted the attack was being merely suspended and could be restarted again at any time if Iraq fails to fulfill its promises. In his television broadcast, President Bush said, "Our military objectives are met. Kuwaitis are in control of their own destiny." The Prime Minister said the Allies are demanding that Iraq destroys all its weapons of mass destruction. Operation Desert Storm itself had been one of the most remarkable military campaigns of all time. The Queen said she was delighted by the news. "The armed forces have done us proud," she said. But Baghdad radio remained defiant to the last. It said Iraq has triumphed after the forces of aggression retreated in defeat.